right, now it's time. Welcome everyone to this short talk. I understand this is Friday afternoon, immediately before a long weekend. So thanks everyone for being here. Before anything, can I ask all participants to mute yourself, please? Okay. All right, so let me first of all just share my screen with you. Okay. All right. So I'm Professor Leo. I'm teaching at Department of English at CUHK. And at my virtual background, you'll be able to see our beautiful campus. It's really a great pity that we can't really meet in person, face to face. So at least you can have a sense of our campus, and hopefully one day we will actually be able to meet face to face. All right, so in this short talk, I'm going to just briefly introduce two of the courses that I teach. One is called 19th Century Novels on Screen, which is a relatively new course that I'm teaching. And the other is Romanticism, which I've taught for many times. So basically, I'm just going to talk very briefly about these two courses so that you have a sort of more specific sense of what it is like to study in our program. Okay, all right, so for both courses, I'm going to cover these points. First of all, what texts or authors that we're going to study, and what film and TV adaptations are we going to study. And then secondly, how are we going to study them? Thirdly, why does it matter to study these texts and adaptations? All right, so I'll start with 19th century novels on screen. In this course, we're going to look at three authors, Jane Austen, Charles Dickens, and Thomas Hardy. And they are really the three authors who have been very, very popular with screen adaptations. We'll start from Jane Austen's Persuasion. Persuasion is actually Austen's last completed novel, and seems to me in many senses it's also her greatest work. And I believe that for many reasons, but I'll just name two. The first reason is that unlike many Jane Austen's novels, which seem to give us this very small sort of miniature world and surrounding a kind of marriage plot, apparently sort of secluded from reality, from actual history. Note that I said apparently. But Persuasion is very much different in that sense. It's actually called the Waterloo novel, because Jane Austen actually wrote Persuasion almost immediately after the Battle of Waterloo was fought. And you all know that at that battle, Napoleon was finally defeated. So in other words, the novel is very much tied up with actual history. And what the novel is about, actually, the temporal setting of the novel, is before the Battle of Waterloo. Nevertheless, the novel is very much about this intimate relationship between an individual's personal fate and national history. Okay? The other very important reason that I think Persuasion is a great work of Austen's is this generally almost new kind of prose style that she developed in Persuasion. And in particular, this is very striking in terms of the narrative style of Persuasion. Again, very much different from most characteristic Jane Austen's novels, where you will find a lot of dialogues, usually comical and witty dialogues. Persuasion does not offer many dialogues. Instead, it's filled up with interior monologues, so that we'll be able to hear the sort of the inner voice of our heroine, Anne. And even the third person narration is very much filtered through the central consciousness of Anne, of our heroine. So that on the whole, the prose and the narrative style reads something very modern, okay? So in fact, the 2 points that I've just talked about, they pose terrible challenges for screen adaptations. So we're going to look at actually two adaptations, mainly focusing on the more recent 2007 Persuasion, but we'll also refer back to a slightly earlier adaptation made in 1995 and talk about how these two adaptations deal with those challenges. All right, so that's Persuasion. And the second work or set of works we're going to look at is Charles Dickens' Great Expectations. And if you look at the publication dates, you see that now we've taken a leap of almost half a century, and we've now moved from the Romantic era to the Victorian era. Okay, so the whole story is basically about the protagonist, Pip's great expectations to be a gentleman. So in a sense, Great Expectations is very much a kind of supreme novel of growth, especially this Victorian novel of growth, this novel of education, this novel of progress. There's a term for that. We call such a novel of growth, such a tale of education, Bildungsroman, okay? But there's something very peculiar going on about this Bildungsroman, in the sense that this tale of growth is fraught with irony. So at the same time, this is also a novel of return. This is also a novel, while the narrative moves forward, it also constantly throws us back towards the very beginning of the tale. It seems that the past is always haunting the present, okay? It's something that the protagonist is never able to shake off. So very intriguingly, I think it's both a Bildungsroman and an anti-Bildungsroman. And one thing that Dickens achieves that effect is through this particular use of the narrator. The whole tale is narrated by Pip, the protagonist. But this narrator is not the Pip who is experiencing all these happenings. Instead, this is a retrospective narrator who has already gone through all these experiences, who knows what's going to happen, so that when we are reading this narrative, which of course moves, in a sort of linear fashion, moves forward, but at the same time, we get a lot of hints to suggest what is going to happen, a lot of foreshadowings. And at the same time, there are also a lot of backtrackings to give a sense of how the present is constantly, as I said, haunted by the past. Okay, so again, how is the film director or TV adaptation director going to deal with this? We're going to look at a quite recent 2011 TV adaptation of Great Expectations, which was actually very positively and very enthusiastically reviewed, especially in comparison to an adaptation which followed immediately in the following year in 2012. So we'll be looking at how this TV adaptation handles Charles Dickens' narrative, handles Charles Dickens' Bildungsroman. And we'll also refer to an earlier adaptation, which is a film. And the film, Great Expectations, is a very daring experiment in the sense that the whole tale is not set in Victorian England. Instead, it's set in the present day United States. The whole tale gets started with Florida, and the aspiration of that protagonist is not to become a gentleman in London. Instead, he would like to become an artist in New York. So we'll be talking about these two adaptations, all right? The last set of works we're going to look at is Thomas Hardy's Far from the Madding Crowd. And you see the publication date, and we've again taken not such a big leap, but of about a decade's time. So we now arrive at the late Victorian era, which was hounded by many different troubles. And I'll just name two, because in this novel, you'll be able to see how these two issues come up to the surface. The first one is the impact of Darwinism and how Darwinism really completely shook the Victorian religious view and worldview on the whole, right? And the second issue that hounded the late Victorian era is the so-called woman question. And this refers to especially in the late Victorian era, which witnessed the transition of a woman's image from this very traditional ideal of the so-called angel in the house to the more rebellious, radical new woman, okay? And in this novel, our protagonist, our heroine, actually embodies that very vividly. So Hardy's novel itself is set in the rural area, and in a lot of beautifully rendered passages, we are presented with this beautiful landscape set in this half fictional world that Hardy calls Wessex. It seems to be very much like a pastoral romance which celebrates rural simplicity, rural ideals, rural innocence, okay? But when you look a bit more closely, you find that in the novel, actually, the most powerful episodes and scenes, they actually give us a very dark picture, showing us very much cruel, malignant, and sometimes simply indifferent forces in humanity, in the natural world, indeed in the entire universe. So in this novel, we see this characteristic, Hardy's full look at the worst. This is something that Hardy wrote in his own poetry. So basically, when something terrible happens, you can be almost certain that something worse will follow. And when you feel what can be even worse than that, you can be certain that, the worst is still to come. So what I'm getting at is that Far From the Madding Crowd is at the same time a pastoral romance, or at least apparently following that mode, and at the same time challenging that mode, that genre, okay? So we'll be looking at this 2015 adaptation, film adaptation, which was actually shot on location of Dorset. And you will be able to recognize that Carey Mulligan is actually our heroine. We'll also be referred back to a 1998 TV adaptation of the novel. All right, so these are the sets of texts that we're going to study. How are we going to approach them? Of course, we're going to focus on how these films, how these TV series adapt the text, okay? I'll give you an example. Here, these are the two shots from the endings of the two different adaptations of Persuasion. And you see that one ending is set in the country estate, actually our heroine's ancestral house. And the other actually concludes the whole TV series on a ship. So both actually adapt the original ending of the text. So we're going to consider why each adaptation has made such a decision, and what does that inform us about what adaptation makes of the original text. Or to give you another example, Miss Havisham is one of the most famous characters in Charles Dickens' Great Expectations. I think if there's a top 10 most famous characters list, she will certainly be included in that top 10 list. So basically, Miss Havisham is this figure who gets jilted by her fiancé right before her wedding. And ever since that moment, she is wearing her bridal dress, and then she's been wearing this for decades, and she stopped every single clock in her house at that precise moment. So time is frozen for her. And in many earlier adaptations of Great Expectations, we see that Miss Havisham is usually acted by an older woman, and she is presented as this scary, cruel, vengeful, witch-like figure. But if you look at this image, this is the new adaptations, Miss Havisham, and acted by Gillian Anderson. And you can see the huge difference of this particular version of Miss Havisham. She is beautiful here in this image. And throughout the whole adaptation, she is fragile, she is vulnerable, she is definitely more sympathetic, okay? So while we'll be looking at these alterations, these adaptations made by the films, by the TV dramas to the original text, we will not stop there. We'll follow up with another question. As I said, why does a particular director or a particular adaptation make such a decision? For example, this rewritten Miss Havisham, does that tell us something about our present cultural context, perhaps informed by the post-feminist world that we are living in, all right? And the two different decisions about the adapted ending of Persuasion, what does each of them tell us about the 1990s and the first decade of the 21st century? So after asking about all these alterations made by the adaptations to the original text, we'll also be exploring how texts adapt themselves to newer contexts, to different times in the future, in their future, all right? And I would suggest actually in exactly adapting themselves, all these classical texts manage to gain sort of a living status, all right? So that they are not simply shelved literary classics remote from our present reality. They're still current because they're being adapted to our reality. So on the basis of that, we will not use the standard of fidelity to evaluate which adaptations are successful, which are not. In other words, we'll not be simply thinking about how faithful that adaptation is to the original text. Instead, we'll be focused more on specificity or intertextuality. We'll be looking at how these adaptations employ medium-specific devices. Again, to give you an example, just now I mentioned in Persuasion, we get this very peculiar kind of narrative style in the text. So the whole tale, this very much repressed romance in Persuasion, is expressed verbally through this particular narrative style. And for the 2007 adaptation, this is translated through camera work. So our heroine is actually, in quite a few moments in the adaptation, she is talking directly to the camera. In other words, she is almost confessing immediately to us, telling us what is going on inside her. All right, so that's what I mean by medium-specific device. And we'll be looking at other medium-specific devices. For example, what is being put into the scene, mise en scène, okay? So here are two shots from Great Expectations again. And this is our young hero, young Pip, who is making the very first visit to Miss Havisham's eerie Gothic place called Satis House. And if you pay close attention to what is being placed in the scene, you see that he is looking at this rather huge glass case in which there are a lot of dead butterflies. And butterfly is a recurring symbol in this adaptation. And we'll be asking, what kind of symbolic meanings does it seem to be taking on, all right? At the same time, you also see a globe, an atlas being put into the scene. What kind of symbolic functions do they serve? And we'll be looking at what is being contained within the borders of a frame, okay? How are characters being placed within it? For example, these two shots are from the 2007 Persuasion. And here you get a sense that this couple of characters, they're very close, very intimate with each other because they share this screen and share this frame And in the frame, there is no other character. And indeed, this is one of the first moments when they start to reconcile with each other after 8 years parting with each other. And then almost immediately afterwards, you find another character literally as an intruder into the frame. How does that change the dynamic of the characters of this couple? All right. We'll also be looking at the tone and the color of filmic shots. These two shots are from far from the madding crowd, and evidently you can see the left-hand side shot is brighter. Indeed, it's lush green. Okay, it's in a much warmer tone, and the right-hand side one is much gloomier and is much bleaker. And the whole tale, both the text, original text, and this film adaptation, places great emphasis on the seasonal cycle and how the seasonal cycle, the seasonal changes also alter the emotional pitch, emotional tenor of the characters and of the characters' relationship. We'll be paying attention to camera angles. The left-hand side shot is from far from the madding crowd. And you see, of course, here our heroine. But then further above, you see this male character called Boatwood is shot from a very low angle and almost out of focus. So from this kind of camera angle, what does that reveal about their relationship? And what kind of image does he seem to have in Bathsheba, our female protagonist's mind? Okay, the right-hand side shot is from the opening scene of Great Expectations. And we see an enormous face of this convict who is going to play an extremely important role in our protagonist's life. And here his face looks not just huge, but also threatening, menacing. And that effect is very much created by this low angle shot. We'll be also considering distance from which the camera is placed. This one, we get an extreme long shot, and we see the human figure here, terribly small, almost inconspicuous, as if he is at the mercy of some much bigger force, right? On the right-hand side, we see from a close-up, very clearly the facial expression of Bathsheba, and she is wearing this almost mischievous smile. And smile is a very important signal as to the emotional transformation that our heroine goes through in the entire novel and the adaptation. Okay, and we'll also be looking at how the frame moves. For example, this one is taken from Persuasion, and while the heroine is running, you see that the camera is running together with her. So it's a tracking shot, all right? And the right-hand side one, this is from the 1998 film adaptation of Great Expectations. And this is a moment when our hero receives this shocking news and then achieves this important recognition of what the truth actually is. And you see how this shot is taken from an oblique angle. So the frame moves towards this oblique angle, and we get this visual sense of dizziness, of almost disorientation. And that visual effect of how the frame moves really captures the psychological shock that he is experiencing. Okay. And we'll also be considering how various shots are being knit together, are being edited together. This is when the couple meet for the first time after 8 years in Persuasion, and we get a series of shots, reverse shot, to show us the kind of tension, the kind of nervous anxiety experienced by the couple. Okay, all right, so we'll be studying all of that, and we'll be approaching all these texts, both the verbal and the filmic texts, from all these elements. Why does it matter to study adaptations? I would suggest 2 points. I'm sure there are plenty more reasons. The first point is I would suggest that to be able to read both the word and the image very sensitively, I think that really constitutes, in a sense, a sort of cultural literacy, especially when you consider how our present contemporary culture is really dominated, not so much by words, but by images. And I would also suggest that being able to read both media sensitively actually will sharpen our sense of the peculiar formal elements of both words and images. All right. The second suggestion that I would like to make is about the currency of the 19th century novels. You get a sense from all these adaptations that the 19th century novels is really a vogue. Why is that? Back in the 19th century, as just now I very briefly touched upon, several very, very important happenings took place. All these novels, they dealt with the Napoleonic War, the Industrial Revolution, the rise of the British Empire, the woman question, etc., etc. And if you think about our own time, what issues we are grappling with, for example, the relationship between our personal fate and national history, the issue of gender identity and relationship, the issue of social mobility and social justice, the clash and tension between globalization and localism, I would suggest that all of these issues, in a sense, started to take shape in the 19th century, and especially becoming so very vivid in 19th century novels. And that's partly why I would say there seems to be a vogue of adapting 19th century novels. And it's exactly in these adaptations that these novels are kept alive, kept living, and kept sort of speaking to us in a very immediate sense. Okay, so that's the first course that I'd like to talk about. And now I'm moving on to Romanticism. What are we going to study? We're going to look at 6 poets, starting from William Blake, then William Wordsworth, and Samuel Taylor Coleridge. They are the so-called older Romantics, the first generation of Romantics, and then to be followed by Byron, Shelley, and Keats. I know some of you have to study several poems for DSE exam. Okay, so, and just by the way, that all these second generation Romantics, they died very young. So when we are talking about Romanticism, the Romantic era, we're really just referring to less than half a century's time, very, very short period. It is indeed the shortest literary period. But within this short time, we see that these Romantic poets, they have created in a sort of extraordinary concentration some of the greatest, best known and dearly beloved sort of poems in English poetic history. And here, just sort of off the top of my head, I'm just quoting some of these, some of the very famous lines from Romantic poetry, and I'm sure you've heard at least some of them. From Blake, to see a world in a grain of sand and a heaven in a wild flower, hold infinity in the palm of your hand and eternity in an hour. From Wordsworth, I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on high o'er vales and hills, when all at once I saw a crowd, a host of golden daffodils. Shelley's famous line, if winter comes, can spring be far behind? And from Keats, season of mists and mellow fruitfulness, close bosom friend of the maturing sun. Okay? I think there's a sort of general impression that all these Romantic poets, they seem to be immersed in their own world, writing about themselves and sort of hiding themselves in a corner in the natural world, secluded, you know, from the wider, bigger world. I want to say at the outset, once you start to study Romantic poetry, you'll find this is a very much romanticized notion of Romantic poets. This is not true. All of these Romantic poets, they were deeply engaged with their own times, the so-called the spirit of the age. And when talking about the spirit of the Romantic age, we're really talking about how the Romantic era was shaped by two revolutions, the French Revolution and the Industrial Revolution. And partly as an aftermath of the French Revolution, the Romantic era also experienced the longest war in modern military history, the Napoleonic War, which lasted more than 2 decades. You know, it should be properly labeled as the First World War. So the spirit of the age, as I said, it's very much the chief inspiration for the Romantic poetry. How are we going to study it? We're going to, of course, read Romantic poetry very, very closely. And we're also going to place Romantic poetry against all these Romantic poets' own life experiences and also against their times. And in this process, we'll be able to see several Romantic themes being very prominent coming up to the surface. And right at the center is this expression of the self, or put it in a different way, this self-expressiveness in Romantic poetry. Wordsworth says very famously that poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. And you will also find in Romantic poetry, it's very often that the Romantic poet is focusing on the fluxes and refluxes of the human mind, okay? At the same time, they're not simply being self-indulgent. In Romantic poetry, we will also find a lot of figures never before entered into the realm of poetry, now being contained in the Romantic poetry landscape. For example, a lot of children in Romantic poetry and a lot of underprivileged figures. Here is a chimney sweeper by Blake, and Wordsworth wrote about an old beggar, a mad woman, an idiot boy, a convict, and so on and so forth. So the Romantic poetic world is a very democratic world, if you like. And of course, another very important theme in Romantic poetry is nature. They write about the beautiful, the serene natural landscape, but they also write about the very shocking, terrifying, awe-inspiring landscape. And once you get into the so-called nature poetry, you will find this label is terribly imprecise because they almost never simply describe what's out there in nature. It's almost always the very intimate interaction between these Romantic poets and the outside nature. And it's not just the natural world they're interested in. They're also interested in the supernatural, in the nightmarish, in the Gothic world. All these romantic poets, they are fascinated with the darker moods experienced by the human mind, the kind of extreme states, psychological states experienced by the human mind. And of course, they also write about the revolution, especially the psychological impact brought by the French Revolution. They write about the sense of excitement, exhilaration evoked, inspired by the revolution. But more importantly, they also write about the trauma, the sense of disillusionment after the failure of the revolution. And at home, actually, Romantic England was a terribly repressive time. We'll also be reading about their sense of shock, their sense of anger, and how they envisage the future in their poetry. Okay? So all of these romantic themes, as I said, they're very prominent, but we are not simply gonna abstract these ideas from the poetry. Instead, you will find that each of these poets, they have a very distinctive poetic voice. And Romantic poetry also has a very tangible, if you like, sort of poetic texture, okay? So we'll be paying special attention to poetic forms. Because just like just now, I was talking about how all these romantic poets, they've introduced many new subject matters into the world of poetry. All these romantic poets, they were also very interested in experimenting with new innovative poetic forms. Here I've got an image, and Blake invented this particular way of printing his poetry, so that every single poem of his is also accompanied with a visual design, all right? And Wordsworth and Coleridge, they published this monumental volume called Lyrical Ballads, which is basically a hybrid form combining qualities of lyrics and ballads. Coleridge has written many conversation poems, very intimate, very personal, and very often sort of unfolding trajectory, emotional trajectory of a mind that is very often going through a sense of crisis. Byron has written a great mock epic, which is a sort of revision of the classic epic form. And his mock epic is satirical, it's funny, it's comical, it's farcical, all right? Shelley has written many powerful but also terribly popular political songs, and all of them, they have adapted, coming back to the term adapt, they have adapted traditional and conventional forms of poems, for example, odes, sonnets, and romances. Okay. So to round up, why does it matter to study romantic poetry? I think the first suggestion I will make is, at least as a romantic scholar, I always have this very strong sense of resonance when reading romantic poetry. The Romantic era really was a time when so many unprecedented events took place. It was a terribly turbulent time, and it's also a time of contradictions, and it's a time of division. It's also an era of transition. And I think a lot of those characteristics apply to our own time as well. And the other suggestion that I will make is the fact that I think we are still very much living in the Romantic legacy. And by that, I mean, the Romantic legacy, I think, has already become part of our cultural heritage. I was just thinking of Matthew Arnold, who is a Victorian writer, who talks about, who actually writes in a poem, talking about what's so great about Wordsworth and his poetry. And he said, you know, there's so many great poets and each of them has a different sort of greatness. But what's so great about Wordsworth is the fact that Wordsworth makes us feel. And I would suggest that this is very much true with every one of the Romantic poets. They have taught us how to feel, that they have not simply changed our ways of thinking, our ways of seeing, they have forever changed our ways of feeling. And just to give you a piece of evidence for that, this is a whole set of Romantic stamps, new stamps issued earlier in this year, 2020. And you see that every stamp is basically a commemoration of more or less the bicentenary of the publication of these Romantic poets. So we are still very much living in this Romantic legacy. Okay, so that is that. And before I let you go, could I please ask you to do one thing? Because both I myself and the department would very much like to know how you feel about this, you know, not just my talk, but this is about, particularly about my talk. So if you can just jot down a few words to say one or two things that you have learned from this talk, this will be tremendously helpful for us. Can you do that in the chat box? Okay. If you have any questions, any comments about this talk, you're welcome to drop me an email. That's my email address. But most importantly, check out our departmental website. That's the link. And apply to our program, come to study with us. All right. So can I please ask you to jot down a few words in the chat box? Then, of course, please feel free to go. And before you go, let me just wish you a nice long weekend. Could you please do that in the chat box? Just jot down, if it doesn't even have to be a complete sentence, you know, 1 or 2 things that you think you have learned from this talk. Thank you. That's from Trista. Thanks, Shelley. Thank you. That's very kind. Thanks, Dexter. Thank you, Eva. Thanks. Thank you, Wani. Thanks a lot, Brittany. Thanks, Sally. I'll just wait for a couple more minutes because I realize that the office is about to close and I don't want to delay them from the weekend. Okay, thanks, Lara. Rowena, thank you. Yeah, that's very true. Thanks, M. Okay, yeah, thank you, Tom. All of your comments are very interesting. Yeah, thanks, Taylor. Exactly. Okay, all right. If you have any other comments or any questions, as I said, feel free to drop me an email. But right now, I'm going to just close today's talk. because as I said, this is really the end of the office hours for the office. So good luck, everyone, and hope to be able to see you in actual person someday, and enjoy the long weekend. Okay, and thanks for attending this. Bye, everyone. Bye.